Hello, good evening. Sorry to keep you all waiting. We're having too much fun here in the green room, the Zoom green room. But I'm Brian Edwards, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts here at Tulane University, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to the third installment in our series called Anti-Racism and the Disciplines. If you are joining us and have not seen the earlier ones, you can check out our website where we archive all of our lectures and conversations, as we will this one. But it's really a special pleasure for me to introduce Lee Baker, and who will be speaking on anti-racism and anthropology. Some of our anthropology faculty know that I have a soft spot for the discipline of anthropology, and spent a year kind of retraining myself in sociocultural anthropology, which of course anyone who works in anthropology knows means having a very complex and vexed relationship to the discipline. And we are thrilled to have really a leader, international leader, in helping us think through the history of the field, and especially in the context of its own relationship to race, racism, anti-racism. Lee Baker joins us today from Duke University, where he is the Mrs. A. Hehmeyer Professor of Cultural Anthropology, Sociology, and African American Studies. As I like to say, the more, when you have people's names in between your name and your title, you know you're a very celebrated professor. And this is another example of that. He received his bachelor's degree from Portland State University and his doctorate in anthropology from Temple University. He has been a resident fellow at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Johns Hopkins Institute for Global Studies, the University of Ghana, at Legon, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Humanities Center. So he has shared his wisdom in very many great institutions. His books include From Savage to Negro, Anthropology and the Construction of Race, 1896 and 1954, a very celebrated book. Life in America, Identity and Everyday Experience. And then most recently, Anthropology and the Racial Politics of Culture. Although he focuses on the history of anthropology, he has also published numerous articles on a wide range of subjects, from sociolinguistics to race and democracy. Dr. Baker also received the Richard K. Lublin Distinguished Teaching Award and the American Anthropological Association's Award for Distinguished Achievement in the Critical Study of North America. Also, and as an academic who's serving as a dean, I'm proud to say he, from 2008 to 2016, he also served as Duke's Dean of Academic Affairs. Dr. Baker, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Let me, since I will be here but disappearing, let me introduce our discussant and interlocutor, and my colleague, Dr. Sabia McCoy-Torres, who after your presentation will ask some questions, have her own, and moderate a discussion. And I want to thank Sabia for joining us and agreeing to do that. Sabia McCoy-Torres is a sociocultural anthropologist and assistant professor of anthropology and Africana studies here at Tulane. Her research focuses on the English and Spanish-speaking African diaspora, race, gender and sexuality, place and space, migration, transnationalism, and Black popular music and performance. Her current book project, and Lee, I want to make sure you hear this because this is going to be a very important book that I hope you will be reviewing, and all those great publications that you write for. Her current book project, Making the Caribbean Migration and Reggae from Costa Rica to Brooklyn, uses reggae culture as a lens to examine these dynamics among Afro-Caribbeans in Limon, Costa Rica, and Brooklyn, New York, looking also at migration between the two locales. And the book makes contributions to the anthropology of joy and studies on diasporas and the formation of Black racial identities. Dr. McCoy-Torres has articles published in Transforming Anthropology, Black Music Research Journal, Popular Music and Society, and the Global South, and is on the editorial board of Transforming Anthropology. And so we're thrilled to have you here too, Sabia. Okay, well, with that, let me turn over to Lee for his remarks. And thank you all. Welcome again, Lee.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this lecture series. And it's also, I think, very forward thinking in terms of really addressing how we can think through anti-racism, specifically through the disciplines and then ultimately interdisciplinary as well. I want to thank Joseph Mistro, who did a lot of the logistics and setting everything up. Sabia McCoy-Torres, who's going to give some comments, and I'm looking forward to having her as my interlocutor and hopefully generating a great conversation. And of course, Brian T. Edwards, the Dean of Arts and Sciences there at Tulane. I just want to say this is a great opportunity to bring, I feel honored to be amongst the lecturers, so I hope I do this service well, but I think it's also important to just mark this as an important contribution to the intellectual landscape right now, which is particularly precarious. This work is called The Racist Anti-Racism of American Anthropology, and I think what I'm trying to get at is there's a long history of people kind of trying to do the right thing, but actually the efforts go off the rails, and we'll talk explicitly about that. I've got some slides, and but I will share that after I do this sort of little intro. Work hard and play by the rules. This simple phrase is an integral part of the mythology of the American dream. But so many hardworking class and people of color know that one can work very hard and play by the rules, but still lose the game. The implication is that if you work hard and assimilate American culture, you can make it in the United States. Racism, however, consistently snatches the American dream from the clutches of many hardworking Americans. Exactly 100 years ago, anthropologist Franz Boas observed that racism and discrimination encumbered and threatened the success of Negro achievement. He also saw his Jewish friends and families assimilate and become white and American. This observation led him to believe that, quote, the Negro problem will not disappear in America until the Negro blood has been so much diluted that it will no longer be recognized. Just as anti-Semitism will not disappear until the last vestige of the Jew as a Jew has disappeared. Assimilation or Americanization was a powerful concept because it assumed equal potential and mobility. It did not, however, address racism or discrimination. As sociologist Robert Park quipped in 1914, quote, if they were given an opportunity, the Japanese are quite as capable as the Italians, the Armenians, or the Slavs of acquiring our culture and sharing our national ideas. The trouble is not with the Japanese mind, but with the Japanese skin. The Jap isn't the right color. In this presentation, I'm going to tell stories of assimilation as racism. Even though the characters were striving to be anti-racist, they engaged and articulated in racism and helped to consolidate whiteness. These are also historical case studies of what Eduardo Bonilla Silva so eloquently explains as racism without racist. I will start with the orphan train and Indian boarding school movements to demonstrate how integral assimilation was to the idea of an American at the turn of the century. I will then turn to Franz Boas's massive study of immigration amalgamation and conclude with his call for Negro amalgamation. Let's get after it. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay, I'm going to assume everything is right. On November 18th, 1904, 12-year-old Bella Quince and 9-year-old Madeline Heller joined a dozen other children ranging in ages from 19 months to 13 years on Van Worden's Opera House in the tiny southern hamlet of Leon. Hailing from the surrounding counties, family farmers crowded into the Opera House that afternoon. Bella and Madeline and other children arrived in Leon by train and were a long way from home. Bella came from the Brooklyn Industrial School and Home for Destitute Children. Bella grew up with her older brother and younger sister in the 5 Point House of Industry in Lower Manhattan. It was a week before Thanksgiving, and the good people of Leon were looking to expand their families with orphans from New York who could also serve as cheap farm labor. The local paper reported, quote, "The children were the brightest and best dressed lot of waifs that have ever been brought to this county, and there was no trouble finding people who were willing to take the little ones in as members of their family. Not unlike a drove of cows or a sounder of prize sows, the children lined up and prospective parents that carefully poked and prodded, inspected and scrutinized each child before making their selection of whom would join them for Thanksgiving." The previous week, the Children's Aid Society of New York took out an advertisement in the Leon Reporter that announced "Homes Wanted for Children. A company of orphan children will arrive at Leon." Sandwiched between ads for yeast and the Great Acorn Gas Burner, the announcement explained that, quote, "Distribution will take place at the Opera House at 1:30. There was, of course, fine print. The object of the coming of these children is to find homes in your midst, especially among farmers where they may enjoy a happy and wholesome family life, where kind care, good example, and moral training will fit them for a life of self-support and usefulness. The society retains the right to remove a child at any time for just cause and agrees to move any found unsatisfactory after being notified." The Children's Aid Society carefully selected Bella and Madeline to be placed out. Charles Loring Brace, the founder of the CAS, began placing out orphan, abandoned, and surrendered children to new families in 1854. He was an idealistic theologian who responded to the estimated 30,000 homeless children who experienced punishing poverty, wretched housing, infectious disease, and paralyzing immobility in mid-century Manhattan. Brace outlined the organization's goals in its mission in its first circular, which began with a lament, quote, "Something must be done to meet the increasing crime and poverty among the destitute children of New York." Steeped in Protestant righteousness and optimistic rhetoric that all children have the same capacity, he aimed to aid this great multitude of unhappy, deserted, and degraded boys and girls. The organization was probably sincerely motivated by saving the children, but it was equally concerned with the children growing up as poor Democrats in New York. Seeking political and financial support, Brace and the CAS peddled imminent doom. "These waifs will soon be the great lower class of our city. They will influence elections. They may shape the policy of this city. They will assuredly, if unreclaimed, poison society all around them. They will help to form the great multitudes of robbers, thieves, and vagrants who are now such a burden on the law-respecting community." The society did challenge the philosophy of many reform organizations because they did not believe that idleness, improvidence, and drunkenness were hereditary in character. Fresh air, hard work, the gospel of Christ in a family could transform these poor wretches into real Americans, which meant white Protestants. This is why the CAS was so committed to, quote, "draining the city of these children," and of course, future Democrats. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society and other organizations that followed were responsible for putting an estimated 250,000 children on trains from Northeast urban city streets to Midwestern rural farms. One donor to the CAS believed, quote, that the law of child supply and child demand can be adjusted like that of commercial commodities. As the number of orphan trains began picking up steam, the CAS developed a tightly choreographed ritual. They selected children who were not sickly, developmentally disabled, incorrigible, nor Black. They then gained legal custody of the children because not all inmates of orphanages were orphans. Poor parents sometimes had to abandon or surrender their children. The agency deployed Western agents to identify prospective towns and convene local leaders to screen applicants. Small, tightly knit towns rarely rejected one of their own. Agents and chaperones would give the children a haircut and a new set of clothes. The children would board the so-called orphan trains in a precarious state of liminality leavened by a collective sense of excitement and hope. When the thunderous trains came to small towns like Leon, shopkeepers and barkeeps, leaders and laborers would watch with curiosity as the amusement as the company of orphans disembarked. At each stop, agents lined the children up for inspection at a church or an opera house. The pre-approved parents would have an opportunity to examine each child, make their selection, and take one or two home. Children not selected would be put back on the train and taken to the next town down the line, and the ritual of distribution, as the CAS called it, would begin again. Many children found loving and supporting families. Many others, however, were victims of physical abuse, sexual violence, and labor exploitation. The orphan train movement is one of many complicated examples of how assimilationist ideas produced racism and white supremacy. Simultaneously, it contributed to the indigenous land disposition, Native American displacement, and the destruction of tribal nation sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Homestead Act of 1862, the Dawes Act of 1887, and other legislation conspired and collided with the massacre at Bear River, Sand Creek, Marias River, and finally Wounded Knee in 1890 to make the second half of the 19th century a formative period in the long history of dispossession and attempted genocide of indigenous nations. Homesteaders played a critical role in the process of displacing and dispossessing indigenous nations on the plains. Homesteaders needed cheap labor, and New Yorkers needed to get rid of their homeless children. As Poles, Italians, and Slavs replaced the Irish as the new and most impoverished immigrants, the locomotives kept running these not quite white orphans west. The children riding the orphan trains played an almost perfectly aligned roles in empire building, indigenous genocide, and the consolidation of whiteness. After a 4-day train ride, Leon, Iowa transformed Bella and Madeline from hungry peddlers and pickpockets to corn-fed white girls helping their new family establish a home on the plains. Promoters of this overnight civilization of waifs copied their much more sophisticated doppelganger, the Carlisle Indian School, by staging dramatic before and after portraits. In 1879, Richard Henry Pratt took command of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in South Central Pennsylvania. Known for his famous slogan, "Kill the Indian and save the man," Pratt's philosophy was to erase and replace indigenous culture with Christian civilization, through strict discipline that combined military organization, penal incarceration, and industrial education. The day his first party of students arrived, he requisitioned 4,000 feet of picket fence, 6 feet high, to keep the Indians in and the citizens out. Some children came by choice, others came by force, most came by train. The first group of children, mostly Oglala Lakota, arrived by train on October 6, 1879. In one of those eerie mirrored plot lines that happen so routinely in the construction of race and white supremacy preservation, the trains ran in opposite directions. Carlisle agents took children from families in the Midwest and put them on trains to institutionalize them in the East. In contrast, CAS agents took institutionalized children in the East and put them on trains to place them with families in the Midwest. Deploying the very same logic regarding assimilation, agents institutionalized Indian children while emancipating white ones. Before 1879 and 1918, Carlisle enrolled over 10,000 students from over 140 nations and became the template for the 26 Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools and hundreds of missionary boarding schools. These institutions became critical operations in the campaign to assimilate and eradicate American Indian bodies, culture, and identity. The orphan train and the Indian boarding school movements were just two of many, many policies and programs committed to assimilation that went, well, off the rails. Assimilation was a compelling discourse and movement that challenged and served as a foil to segregation, eugenics, xenophobia, and anti-immigration. But here's the thing about foils and heroes or villains. They're characters in the same story. And this story is the story of white supremacy. Eastern European immigrants who followed the seductive prescription of a strict regime of assimilation became white and American, while Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans became respectable. Both nativist and assimilationists viewed Japanese and Chinese immigrants as unassimilable. Settlement house workers, missionaries, and the YMCA viewed Americanization rhetoric and assimilationist policies as a progressive way to unite all Americans. People viewed its cognate cousin, amalgamation, as even radical. Yet assimilation was racist, and it contributed to white supremacy because it equated Americanness with whiteness. It was a coercive social control mechanism that disciplined and surveilled European immigrants while using a Sharpie to demarcate the color line. In 1904, immigration to the United States exceeded 800,000. President Theodore Roosevelt told a joint session of the 58th Congress that, quote, "We cannot have too much immigration of the right kind, and we should have none at all of the wrong kind. The need is to devise a system by which undesirable immigrants shall be kept out entirely, while desirable immigrants are properly distributed throughout the country." Congress agreed and set out to develop a fair and scientific system. Vermont Senator William Dillingham was chair of the Senate Committee on Immigration and brought Roosevelt two bills to sign, the Naturalization Act of 1906 and the Immigration Act of 1907. Together, this legislation outlined new processes and federal standards for naturalization and immigration, and it made speaking English a requirement for citizenship. It also clarified that all idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, epileptics, insane persons, and persons who have been insane within the last 5 years were to be denied entry. It also denied access to people likely to become a public charge, criminals, anarchists, polygamists, prostitutes, and contract laborers. Chinese exclusion remained intact. Finally, it authorized a bipartisan joint commission to study different aspects of the immigration question scientifically. The hope was that science could inform legislation to mitigate, manage, and restrict the throngs of tempest-tossed masses arriving on America's shores. President Roosevelt appointed a 9-member joint commission that included the moderate Dillingham and conservative Henry Cabot Lodge. The president also appointed Jeremiah Jenks, a political economy professor at Cornell University. The 9-member commission convened in April of 1907 and elected William Dillingham, chairman of the commission. Known as the Dillingham Commission, it was Professor Jeremiah Jenks who drove the capacious research agenda that deployed over 300 staff members to investigate nearly every aspect of the immigrant problem. Jenks assembled an impressive team of distinguished scholars and commissioned them to write book-length monographs. In March of 1908, Jenks approached the prominent anthropologist Franz Boas about investigating the, quote, question relating to the immigration of different races in this country. Franz Boas was an assimilated German Jew who came to the United States to pursue a science career and his fiancée in 1887. He conducted linguistic research in the Pacific Northwest, ethnographic research in Greenland, and physical anthropological studies on so-called half-blood Indians and immigrant children. Columbia University had recently appointed him as professor of anthropology. During this period, influencers reinforced the strict racial hierarchy with science that purported that Teutonic and Aryan whites were naturally and morally superior to others who were less fit and socially inferior. The perceived superiority of Christian civilization was all the evidence they needed to confirm it. As early as 1894, Boas argued, quote, historical events appear to have been much more potent in leading races to civilizations than their faculty. Therefore, we cannot assume that one race is more highly gifted than the other. It's hardly possible to say, he wondered, what would become of the Negro if he were able to live with whites on absolutely equal terms. Instead of viewing the Negro as inferior, we might rather wonder how much has been accomplished in a short period against heavy odds. Franz Boas was one of the most accomplished anthropologists in the country. He was consistent and effective in battling against scientific arguments that positioned races or cultures in a hierarchy. He was also an immigrant and incredibly skeptical of reformers who used the science of pure and superior races to support regulating and restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. After the initial inquiry by Jenks, Boas wasted no time and fired off an ambitious 7-page proposal to examine the children of immigrants' head shape and bodily form. He began by describing the change in immigration from the, quote, tall, blonde Northwestern type to the masses of people belonging to the East, Central, and Southern European types, and that are now pouring into our country. Boas confidently proposed a simple but profound research question to frame his elaborate proposal. How will this change in the physical type of immigrants influence the marvelous power of amalgamation our nation has exhibited for so long a time? In total, he proposed measuring a whopping 120,000 immigrants. Boas' enthusiasm for the massive project and his posture as an assimilated and white American is evidenced in the proposal's last line. I can assure you that the practical results of this investigation will be important because it will settle once and for all the question of whether immigrants from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe are and can be assimilated by our people. Jenks told Boas that he consulted with 2 Cornell anthropologists who expressed, quote, a strongly favorable opinion regarding the quality of the proposal, although both of them are of the mind that possibly the concluding sentence is somewhat too enthusiastic. By the middle of May, the commission finally authorized the study and allocated $1,000 and expected a narrower scope in a preliminary report before committing to fund it in its entirety. Boas wasted no time. He assembled his team, which consisted mostly of graduate students, Columbia colleagues, and a handful of paid assistants. His main assistants were Dr. C. Ward Crampton and Dr. Maurice Fishberg. Crampton was vital because he was the director of physical training for the New York Board of Education and got Boas into the public schools. In a mad dash to measure as many school children as possible before the summer recess, they scattered across the city. Armed with an official letter of introduction from the United States Immigration Commission that implied that it was one's patriotic duty to participate, but because by doing so, you were rendering a genuine service to the public. One team went north to the brand new Gothic campus on 130th Street to measure students at City College and its affiliated high school. Crampton set off with 500 slips and went to work to measuring students in public high schools throughout the city. Boas took a crew down to Ellis Island. As health officials checked for trachoma, lameness, and insanity, Boas weighed and measured the new arrivals with tape and calipers. They eventually made their way to the schools and orphanages of the Children's Aid Society. If Bella and Madeline had not boarded the orphan train to Iowa 4 years earlier, Boas would have measured them too. Boas and his team measured nearly 13,000 people that summer. It was a frenetic season of weighing and measuring, tabulating and correlating, organizing and categorizing. And in the middle of it all, Boas sent Jenks an optimistic note, quote, I think these results will throw a great deal of light upon the processes that are at work in Americanizing or keeping distinct from the American population, the descendants of the recent immigrants. Boas submitted an update to Jenks at the beginning of September. Although characteristically cautious, he reported, much to my surprise, an important change in type may also be noticed in the Eastern European Jew. The race is very short-headed, but there is a decided tendency to an increase in length of head among the latter immigrants. The commission agreed to continue funding the project, but in paltry and a piecemeal fashion. The research continued apace into the school year, focusing on Russian Jewish and Southern Italian immigrants. As autumn wore on, Boas became bitter because he was not getting paid what he was expected. As winter turned to spring, the team kept measuring children and families throughout the boroughs. money problems continued to bedevil the project. Quote, I'm very much embarrassed on the account of the payments to my assistants. My assistants have not received any pay so far. Boas was exhausted and exacerbated. This is exceedingly embarrassing to me, he lamented and pleaded with Jenks to, quote, just straighten out the entire matter. Although frustrated by funding shortfalls, Boas was buoyed by his data, particularly among the Eastern European Jew and the Southern Italians. He was confident that the data, quote, would enable us to draw unassailable conclusions in regard to the influence of the American environment upon these two types. Boas spent the summer tabulating, organizing, and analyzing over 26,000 immigrants' measurements compiled into 504 pages of raw anthropometric data. An astonishing pattern emerged from the detailed statistics. On October, Boas confidently reported to Jenks that, quote, as far as the head form is concerned, the exceedingly short-headed Eastern European Jew and the exceedingly long-headed South Italian converge to the same form even in the first generation of immigrants, descendants of immigrants. I believe this fact is highly significant, end of quote. Jenks wanted the full report by March, but Boas begged for more time. Quote, the statistics are so involved and the results so radically opposed to all our present theories that it seems indispensable to exclude in the most careful manner every possible source of error which might serve as a basis of an attack on the validity of our results. Boas understood that his data would challenge the scientific consensus that racial features like the cephalic index characterized a stable and permanent type that lasted without variation. His data indicated that immigrants' children became much more like the American norm in one generation. On December 2nd, 1909, Boas sent Jenks his preliminary report. He was confident that the report would, quote, bring about a radical change in our whole conception of racial stability. The commission presented Boas' report to Congress on December 16, 1909. The next day and for weeks after, newspapers and magazines wrote articles, summaries, and editorials across the country and the pond. The United Press wired a dispatch to its syndicate, so even the smallest papers reported the story. The Fargo Forum and Daily Republican headlined "An American Type" and noted that the chief surprising results thus far attained is that of rapid assimilation to a distinctly American type. Wilmington's Evening Journal headlined "America Changes Immigrants' Form." The Washington Times suggested that, quote, if all comers to American soil merge in the direction of a common American type, the logic of the situation is that we have no cause to fear immigration. The Baltimore Sun, Chicago Daily Tribune, the Santa Fe New Mexican, Washington Post, Washington Evening Star, and even the Napa Weekly Journal ran articles detailing the preliminary report's finding and hailing the American type. Britain's Manchester Guardian wrote that the report, quote, should bring some comfort to those patriotic Americans who believe that the foreign immigrants to the United States are a menace to their race. Hampton magazines, with a circulation of almost 500,000, thoroughly misquoted Boas, stating that he, Boas, quote, asserted that children of immigrants become Americanized by the very air of America, forming a distinct type from their parents, and that the new type was American, not foreign. Burton J. Hendrick of McClure's magazine wrote one of the report's most sophisticated and detailed reviews in the popular press. The 15-page essay directly challenged the more sensational interpretations and showed detailed pictures, maps, and graphs. We must understand, he wrote, quote, that the term American type is, from the standpoint of science, pure nonsense. But if it is possible in a single generation to give the child of a different shaped skull from his parents, it is likewise possible to fill it with high ideals, to make him what his father was not and probably never can become, an intelligent, self-respecting, industrious American. Boas' report went viral, well, for its day, as Israel Zangwill's influential play, The Melting Pot, concluded its 4-month run on Broadway. And in the wake of George Cohan's super patriotic musicals like Little Johnny, featuring Yankee Doodle Dandy in 1904, and The American Idea in 1908, each depicting recent immigrants becoming true blue, or more accurately, true white Americans. The New York Times ran several less sensational and more skeptical articles about the report. The New York Times Magazine, however, published 2 full broadsheet spreads that gushed praise. One summarized his research and concluded that, quote, the fears of the Native American that he may be swamped by this influx of Migrants, Slavics, and other impossible peoples are utterly groundless. The other New York Times Magazine article was a lengthy interview with Boas about his report findings. It ran the day after Christmas. It had pictures, graphs, and research tables, and the headline read, Professor Boas gives startling results. Quote, startling is a large word to use, the Times admitted, but it is only what is called for by the results of Professor Boas's work. The final sentence concluded with an optimistic quote from Boas. So far as the races of Europe are concerned, there is nothing in evidence that would stamp one as inherently less able than the other. The reporter didn't follow up. Was Boas implying that races other than European ones were stamped from the beginning? 4 days later, on New Year's Eve, 1909, Boas provided some critical insight into this question. Taking advantage of his recent publicity, he asked for more funding to expand the study. Boas explained to Jenks that if his research could be extended, quote, all fears of unfavorable influence of Southern European immigration upon the body of our people should be dismissed. Quote, perhaps even more important, Boas explained, is the problem of mixtures of distinct types. Here it is, particularly the question of the mixture between the Negro and the white that should receive particular attention. Broadly speaking, the question before us is that of whether it is better for us to keep an industrially and socially inferior large Black population, or whether we should fare better by encouraging the gradual process of lightening up this large body of people by the influx of white blood. Expressing the question still in other words, we might say the question before us is whether conditions can be so regulated that without proportionate increase in the Black population, it will be of advantage to accelerate the infusion of white blood among them. Regulating reproduction through segregation and sterilization were cornerstones of the eugenics movement. Boas was floating the wacky idea that the federal government should develop a eugenics program to incentivize or regulate, quote, a process of lightening up Black people by the infusion of white blood. He did not speculate about the details. The marvelous power of amalgamation, which he touted in his original proposal, transformed Eastern and Southern Europeans effortlessly into the American type. The power of amalgamation was not so marvelous for the industrially and socially inferior Negro. They would need some assistance to become American. Franz Boas was an indefatigable crusader against scientists and policymakers who used their authority to argue that races and cultures were superior or inferior. He attacked their logic and flimsy evidence with rigor and enthusiasm. However, there was limits to his liberalism. In the winter months of 1909 and 1910, Boas presented compelling evidence to Congress that Sicilians and Russian Jews, 2 distinct and inferior races of Europe, became American in 1 generation, which was anti-racist, like for them. With the eager press riding shotgun, he won a significant shootout in the battle to consolidate whiteness, which buoyed the nascent Americanization movement with scientific evidence. The trade-off and long-term consequences for non-white people were devastating. Boas had to emphasize the broad gulf of difference between the white races and the types and non-white races. By slip-sliding between race and type, American and American, Boas also contributed to, and the press enthusiastically influenced, the alignment of whiteness with what it means to be American, which was an articulation of anti-Black racism. Boas first proposed the idea of Negro amalgamation in December 1908 when he gave his vice presidential address to Section 8 of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Baltimore. The bulk of his paper argued that there are no pure races or stocks in Europe, and while there are subtle regional differences, most Europeans were admixtures of these types. He concluded his talk with a discussion about Negro admixture. Quote, when compared with the contrast between the Negro and white, Boas explained, the difference of the European type seemed insignificant, and the unity of the European race, as contrasted with that of the Negro race, becomes at once apparent. Looking into the distant future, he concluded, the number of full-bloods will rapidly decrease. And since there is no introduction of new Negro blood, there cannot be the slightest doubt that the ultimate effect of the contact between the two races must necessarily be a continued increase in the amount of white blood in the Negro community. Boas published his address in the May issue of Science, and W.E.B. Du Bois reprinted most of it in the November issue of The Horizon. Du Bois and Boas had collaborated previously, and Du Bois would often cite Boas's claim that Africans were smelting iron when Europeans were still using stone tools. Du Bois may have been intrigued with the address because Du Bois must have been intrigued by the address because he invited Boas to expand on it for the final lecture at the upcoming NAACP conference that May. Boas' paper at the organization's second annual conference was titled The Real Race Problem. He began his lecture using his signature formula and preferred tactic to combat the science of racial superiority, which was serving as scientific skeptic and debunker in chief. He asserted that, quote, the anthropologists recognize that the Negro and the white represent the two most divergent types of mankind. Boas explained the whole anatomical and physiological comparison of the Negro and the white race may be summed up by the fact that hardly any traits develop in a manner that we are justified in calling one race anatomically or physiologically higher than the other. So far, Boas had given what he had evolved as something of a formulaic stump speech. Unlike previous lectures, Boas shifted gears from describing and debunking to prescribing and provoking. Boas shared his observation that in countries around the world inhabited by Northern Europeans, particularly Teutonic nations, quote, the intensity of race feeling is calibrated by the magnitude of the social divisions. Boas was not optimistic that our general attitude will change to any appreciable degree in a measurable time. So he prescribed for the Negro the somewhat successful strategy of German Jews, not necessarily Russian Jews, of actively assimilating within American society. In 1921, Boas described the strategy more succinctly. In a race of octoroons living among whites, the color question would probably disappear. As Boas saw it, the new Negro was no Negro at all. For the NAACP, he advanced a provocative strategy. It was nothing short of conceding that if you can't beat them, join them. Boas stated, it seems obvious that our race problems will become less intense the less the difference in type there is between the different groups of our people, concluding that, quote, one aspect of the solution of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself. Perhaps he should have said herself. Boas sincerely, if not naively, believed that African-American women should take proactive steps to quicken the inevitable process of lightening up the race through amalgamation. The previous year, he presented a rather clinical description to the AAAS. For the NAACP, however, he gave a full-throated exegesis on the gender dynamics of interracial sex and the racial politics of classifying children born from those sexual encounters, voluntary or not. Quote, the simple facts that Negroes and Europeans live side by side in our country, that the European receives constant large additions from abroad while the amount of Negro blood receives no additions from outside, must necessarily lead to the result that the relative number of pure Negroes will become less and less in our country. The gradual process of elimination of the full-blooded Negro may be retarded by anti-miscegenation legislation, but it cannot possibly be avoided. He's saying this to the NAACP. Boas was aware of what he called the bulky literature of this subject of miscegenation, most of which he believed did not stand up to serious criticism. He also understood the phantasmic panic, fear, and the ensuing violent terror meted out on the bodies of Black men who allegedly polluted the purity of white womanhood. However, Boas implied there was no need for fear because there was a very serious misunderstanding of the actual conditions of intermixture between Negro and white. Now, this is a long quote, but I think it's important to see where Boas is trying to develop this argument. The fear is, quote, the fear is often expressed by intermixture between whites and Negroes. The whole mass of the white population might be infused with a certain amount of Negro blood. This is not what has actually occurred, but would result if unions between white women and Negro men were as frequent as unions between Negro women and white men. As a matter of fact, however, the former type of union, that of the Negro male and the white female, are exceedingly few in number as compared to the others. It therefore follows that our mulattoes are almost throughout the offspring of Negro mothers and white fathers. It thus appears that in all cases where a mixture between whites and Negroes occurs, as long as that mixture is predominantly a mixture of white fathers and colored mothers, the relative proportion of blood in the following mixed generation becomes less, and therefore a gradually increasing similarity of the two racial types may develop. Boas stated that, quote, this one aspect of the solution of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself. Wittingly or not, Boas was prescribing a program of applied eugenics as a solution to the race problem, and white people need not fear amalgamation because it only improves the Negro race and does not impair the white race. Boas never mentions the 300 years of industrial terrorism in the form of routinized rape of Black women by white men. Yet not so subtly, he implied the solution to the real race problem lies between the legs of Black women. Whew. The New York Times headline, Professor Boas predicts race amalgamation means Negro elimination. The union of fathers and mothers will bring this about. The Baltimore Afro-American reported extensively on the three-day conference that excerpted many of the conference speakers. The editors declined to mention Boas except as one of the many speakers. W.E.B. Du Bois selected Boas's The Real Race Problem as the lead article for the second issue of the first volume of The Crisis. In 1912, Du Bois subsequently reissued it as one of the NAACP's many standalone pamphlets. It's not entirely clear to me why Boas promoted this address so conspicuously. Did the ever-pragmatic Du Bois make a calculated decision that the body of the address, which the nation's foremost anthropologist explicitly argued that Negroes were not inferior to whites mentally and physiologically, and that outweighed his cringeworthy solution? Or did Du Bois want to promote any legitimate science that endeavored to hush the relentless din of panic scholars reinforcing Jim Crow by claiming that African Americans were inherently inferior and warning that miscegenation would befall American civilization? What is clear to me is that progressive ideals grounded on assimilation can go off the rails, like the orphan train and the American Indian boarding school movements. The early Americanization movement had to demonstrate the enormous gulf between the white and other races to show that Southern and Eastern Europeans would become just as American as other whites. C. Loring Brace, Richard Henry Pratt, and Franz Boas sincerely believed in the power of assimilation and that the right environment can improve life outcomes. Bella and Madeline were proof of that. Like many progressive era reformers, each was striving to find solutions to combat race antipathy, or today we say do the work of anti-racism. Racism is a scavenger ideology. It maintains its power by being able to appropriate, pick out, recycle, and deploy ideas from other ideas and values. Our use of different ideas use different ideas toward the same end of consolidating and institutionalizing white supremacy. Many of the 20th century solutions to its many problems, Negro, immigrant, Indian, Asian, turned on the lose-lose and inherently racist debate around segregation with its autonomy and agency, or assimilation with its dependency and conformity. And this is like my conclusion, for out of the way others like Native Americans and people in American colonies such as Samoa, anthropologists articulated a powerful and persuasive anti-racist discourse of cultural autonomy and agency and racist segregation. For in the way others, like immigrants and Black people, anthropologists joined sociology and social work to articulate a powerful and persuasive anti-racist discourse of equality and potentiality and racist assimilation. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to unshare.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you, Dr. Baker, for your great talk. I also want to thank Dean Edwards for that very kind introduction of me at the beginning of the presentation. So I guess before I get to picking your brain about your presentation and your greater body of work, it's really important to me to comment on how your book, From Savage to Negro, is a text that I assign to graduate students and undergraduate students alike with equal positive reception and understanding, which is also important with these scholarly texts. And I see it as canonical to unveiling the historical role of anthropology as a discipline in not only being complacent with, but also actively condoning pseudoscientific racism and the logics of coloniality. And people within the academy and outside are very aware of this history, and I feel like it creates a climate of suspicion, especially among students of color, of the discipline. But what I also love about your book, or specifically From Savage to Negro, is that it grapples with that history, but also, and very importantly, highlights anthropology's role in revising it and spearheading the now widely accepted notion that race is a social construct. It's also important to unveiling the hidden figures like African-American writer and lesser known anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, and also the relationship between W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas, and especially Du Bois's influence on Boas's work in important ways. So I feel like in working with that thorny and vulnerable history in From Savage to Negro, and in your presentation today, and in your work more broadly, you show how anthropologists are working to decolonize academia and scholarship, and in a way that I feel invests the discipline with hope and shows students that there are affirming spaces for advocacy within the discipline, which eases their concerns. And I remember as a grad student eased mine as well. So thank you for your anti-racist work within the discipline. So specifically with your presentation, it was so clear and well thought out that I find that most of my questions are directed towards asking how you might conceptualize the present moment in relationship to the historical dynamics that you describe. But before I get to that line of questioning, I'm really curious how Boas grappled with the rule of hypodescent, or the one-drop rule, which seems a major contradiction to his notion that racial amalgamation would get rid of the Negro problem. And we have Homer Plessy, and in Louisiana in 1982, Susie Gilroy Phipps, who advocated for Black to be taken off of her passport because these were white passing people who were nonetheless racialized as Black. So how, if at all, did he grapple with that? Oh, you're muted.
So I think his idea was that, the one drop rule won't be as significant if there's a bunch of like octoroons walking around or this text. I mean, it's so cringeworthy. And I've done a lot of work on Boas, and I really respect him. And this is one of the few times it's not a real good look for him. But there's many other times when he's done a lot of great work. Nevertheless, I think he kind of believed that there was, well, two things. amalgamation at that particular time was profane. I mean, people, you could get lynched for talking about it. And so there was this sort of radical piece of it. And he also sort of almost thought maybe it would be inevitable. And if this happens, both color, blood, what he called Negro blood, would be so diluted, but then also actions and culture would change. So he saw it like the Eastern Europe. I think he saw it like the German Jews, like once they become well assimilated, they just become Americans. And that, I think that was his goal. And so I don't think he thought about it very specifically, but the people in the NAACP were there. I mean, I can't imagine what the audience were. It was Ida B. Wells was there. She's probably clutching her pearls, like, what is this guy talking about?
Yeah.
And they were all, well, and it's complicated because some of them kind of bought into the whole light skin respectability piece of it too. And why Du Bois really thought this was so important to republish and publish in The Crisis as a featured research article is an interesting question.
Thank you.
But yeah, I don't think he really thought much about it. And he assumed that, once race and culture and behavior changed, there would be less tension.
Right. That makes sense. And listening to your presentation and Boas's assertion of the usefulness of racial amalgamation, I couldn't help but miss, of course, which you commented on, its very specific gendering. And I'm actually wondering if you could elaborate on that, because it seems like there might have been awareness of on Boas's part of the sort of sensitivity towards the anxiety surrounding Black masculinity that was evident, under slavery, in the castration of Black men when they were hung. And so I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, if you see him as having kind of this awareness of just how far he could and could not push.
I think he was a pretty savvy guy, and he was reading the papers, and he was very familiar with lynching, and he saw, what the fear was. And I guess his idea was, I don't know what you're so afraid about. It doesn't happen that much, based on his analysis. And he did study a lot of mixed race, both Native Americans and African Americans, because he was really trying to prove that like mulattoes weren't inferior, like a lot of people were sort of thing. So no, he knew he couldn't really go there and push it, which is doubly problematic, because then it's like, but it's okay for the women to be exploited by white men, and they have to do the burden, because if it fell on the white men, it just, so he was doing some really fancy footwork that was sort of sexism, kind of without sexist, in the same way it was racism without racist.
Right.
So yeah, literally, Black women had to do that work. I mean, he was explicit. And again, what was Mary Church Terrell doing at the time? I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of irony, or I guess maybe irony is not the word, but that if we think of slavery as a context in which capitalism was birthed from the womb of Black women, then Boas's logic was sort of a continuation of the notion that therefore Black women were supposed to be responsible for the upliftment of the race through the continued exploitation of the womb, right?
Yeah, and the other piece of that, though, which is also kind of equally troubling, is he had to have been, so this is 1909, so it's before, all the Hitler and stuff, but he experienced anti-Semitism, and he had to be so pessimistic about the ability for America to embrace a racialized other that it was better that they just go away. I mean, that's a kind of level of pessimism and cynicism that he does not believe that racism will ever give a solid shake to African Americans. And as a scientist, he thought, well, let's try to solve the problem. Well, and so you can kind of see his logic, which twisted as it is, but yeah, there's sort of a level of pessimism that's sort of interesting, and he was definitely kind of onto something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of like, how do we get around the deeply entrenched logic rather than deconstructing it? And it seems
Right.
that's what the approach was.
Right. How do you get around it?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that's maybe with where we just ended up right then, a good opportunity for me to kind of jump to asking you how you see the dynamics you discuss as informing the present moment, by asking if you can identify the perils of current anti-racist work, and maybe condoning, if not buttressing, unintentionally the very systems they intend to deconstruct. Or I guess in using the language of your talk, what do you see as maybe going off the rails, right? Because I loved how you said, this practice, which was anti-racist for them, right? Like anti-racism is relative to the moment. And so the anti-racist work of Boas was anti-racist, but it actually, in effect, supported white supremacy. So is there anything that you kind of identified today as anti-racist work that nonetheless condones the very systems it intends to deconstruct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Let's just say,
we're calling in now. We're not going to call out, right? We're not calling
right.
out the discipline or anti-racism work, but
No, so there's a lot of, and I mean, so much of, well, conservative, but I mean, the history of progressivism in America is very complicated and fraught with many of these sort of great intentions, bad outcomes. And there's a lot of that sort of happening today. One of the best examples I can use is, a lot of universities around the country are hiring new, some of our friends have taken advantage of this. There's been, hirings of people that are doing work in anti-racism and hiring people doing this sort of work. But even if and I've seen this with my own eyes, I'm not going to call out which department, you've got a candidate and the goal is to hire someone who can teach an anti-racism, but they use the same exact criteria as they've been using forever, and you're going to get the same exact. I mean, so it's this great intention, but it's like, well, do they have a great CV? Have they published enough? Have they gone to the right schools? Do they have the right pedigree? It's like, wait a minute, you're reproducing racism right now as we're trying to hire someone because we're in a moment of trying to combat it. And that's pretty routine. So, just because people can sort of virtue signal and sort of say, I've done this and we're doing that, it's not changing the needle until we actually change the record. I mean, we really have to shift the script in a big way. And I don't think that's really, really happening.
Yeah. I guess returning, I want to make sure I don't dominate the question and answer time, but I'm such an appreciator of your work and was so fascinated by your talk. I'm curious if you identify any specific legacies that have resulted from the work, from Boas's work, and also from the orphan train and Carlisle Indian boarding school movements. If you identify some legacies today, at least in how the American norm was established, or any other legacies.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest legacies, and I'm not sure, am I glitching?
Not on my end. No.
Oh, you're not, because it looks like I'm on my end. So I'm just going to continue and let me know if I need to recalibrate or something. So probably, I would say 3 very specific things. So what Boas's work did was sort of galvanize this movement called Americanization, which was about assimilation. And it was all about, speaking English, being able to be more disciplined, being able to work in Ford Motor Company, learn American values and all that sort of stuff. So it was a disciplining and surveilling sort of way of ensuring and inviting European immigrants to conform. But they became white. And that was a good enough trade-off for most people. The second piece is that then it enabled that consolidation of whiteness, which was sort of huge going on. And then it also said there's something different between Asians, Blacks, and Native Americans that were very different than Eastern European Poles versus Hungarians versus Swedes or whatever. They said that's all the one race. The second piece, particularly Carlisle Institute and the others, is this notion that assimilation is going to help you become more American, when indeed you didn't become American, you just became respectable. Mm-hmm. And so this respectability trap is kind of what I call it, is a trap, because you almost have to jump in the trap, but you're never going to get free, because the alternatives, the sacrifice, and it's the price you pay if you're not participating in this respectability politics is huge. And a lot of people have talked about that. Rashay Barnes has one of the best sort of raps on this. And so what we've seen, particularly in the last couple of weeks with these shootings in Atlanta, model minorities aren't really model. They've done all the work. They're respectable. They're assimilated until they're not. And then all the anti-Asian rhetoric and violence comes out. And I really did, Dean Edwards had a great kind of anti-Asian statement on the website. I really appreciated that. But it's sort of like, well, heck, if these model minorities can't make it across that threshold, good luck with the folks that are furthest down. So the respectability trap, I think, was part of this too, because there was this idea that assimilation through culture as well as race enables you to become more American, where indeed we've seen it does not.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't help but throw in one more question, just because you brought up the anti-Asian violence that has increased around the US in the pandemic era. That's, a continuation also of the history of anti-Chinese exclusion that you mentioned in your talk as well, right? And you also commented in your presentation that I took a note on it. Racism is a, quote, scavenger ideology that, quote, maintains its power by being able to appropriate, pick out, and recycle and deploy ideas. And I feel like that is really well juxtaposed with Boas's observation that the intensity of race feeling is calibrated by the magnitude of the social divisions, right? Mm-hmm. And so bearing in mind the scavenger ideology and the intensity of race feeling, where do you see the current moment as articulating or reflecting race as a scavenger ideology? And what does the intensity of race feeling bring us today?
Well, it creates the takeover of the Congress, the House of Representatives, by crazy white people thinking that they're calling themselves patriots. I mean, that's where it brings us, because that would not have happened in the same way if Georgia didn't get out the vote, and they sort of precinct by precinct, people showed up and voted. And that was then feeling that it was aggrieved, and it was very racialized, very, very racialized, particularly in places where there are contested votes. In Georgia, for example, North Carolina, these states that have large numbers of African Americans, and when we vote, we can swing a state. Mm-hmm. And so that's where a lot of this most anger could come from. I mean, I think that's part of it. That's what I would say. Mm-hmm. So it's not looking good. And democracy is going to be really, really tested once people of color are the majority consistently. Mm-hmm. And we'll and democracy, white supremacy. I'm not betting on democracy. I mean, I hope to, but simple majority democracy, as we've seen, Jim Crow 2.0 in Georgia, they just rewrote the codes because too many people voted.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, too many people voted, so how can we suppress the vote? They weren't even hiding it. Yeah. I don't know, let me stop. I'm getting
getting fired up. I mean, the continued relevance of these statements is, not surprising, but nonetheless still carry that kind of emotional weight. And definitely for me, it's always affirming when I see that my students are able to identify how racism is a scavenger ideology when they make connections across different geographic spaces throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and draw connections to the US, and see how similar ideology is deployed, and yeah, in ways that we feel should be surprising, but we're not surprised by, right?
And I think that that's true. That what does give me hope, and hopefully this generation will rock and roll with it, is the sort of the sophisticated analysis of the 20-something group these days, in terms of, even seeing the protests this summer, and how they're deploying social media. In my own students, the sophisticated writing that they're doing, it does give me sort of more hope. And let's hope that they can. I feel bad that we left them a mess, but
right, little by little, the work gets done, right? And thinking about what you just said, it's widely noted the challenges of moving beyond race, right? And another voice that enters the debate, Chance, maybe the intention should not be to move beyond race, but actually unpack the inequalities that are tied to race. Because racial identity politics has actually been effective in doing anti-racist work, right? And essentially we need race for racial identity politics. And then of course, racists also can be invested with pride, particularly for marginalized people. When they convert this source of pride into a political resource, that's also an effective anti-racist strategy. And so I guess, can you comment on that tension between moving beyond race, but also needing race and the salience of race to find the forms of advocacy to contest racism?
Yeah, I think I like to play around with the idea of congregation, not segregation. And I think we do share a culture, we share a community, we share a history, a culture, a tradition. We share sort of ownership in America too. I mean, we have like literally sweat equity. We built this country. We shouldn't shy away from not trying to claim our Americanness, but it's just a different than what people say is a white Americanness, and teasing those things apart is really important. But I think it should be a choice, right? Like when you congregate, when you lean on this particular identity or culture or whatever. And I don't think the ticket often has to be total assimilation either. It shouldn't just be a brown version of what, that sort of respectability. I'm trying to think of the right word, sort of figure almost. It's sort of, this is what it looks like to be respectable Black. I think, in the Black Lives Matter movement, the queering of the movement, we are in your face Black, and we're doing this, and we're not respectable, but we want your respect. We respect you when you have to listen to us. I think is a new model of what is like pluralism, and pluralism is more like it done in Europe, but where people have real power, but have real difference outlooks and everything. And I think that's going to be a model we have to really think in kind of sophisticated ways. But no, I don't think, because what you get is just like the amalgamation and disappearing of a whole culture, and that's called genocide, right? So I don't think I think it's something we have to embrace and really embrace, but get and maybe we can get around race, but we have to really start focusing on racism.
Mm-hmm. I think that where we've gone with our discussion is actually, it's a great moment to field some questions from the audience that are related. And one question is specifically about if you can comment more or familiar with the impacts of Boas's work in Latin America. Of course, what he's essentially was condoning was mestizaje, right? The blanqueamiento, the whitening of the population. And so, yeah, can you speak to his impact throughout the Americas more broadly?
Well, Sabia, I don't really, I mean, this is brand new research for me, so I haven't gone that deep, but particularly on the amalgamation side. So I just haven't gotten to it. You might be able to help answer that question more than I could. I do know at the same time, he is, at the very same time, he's going back and forth. He's starting a archaeology school of American archaeology in Mexico City. So he's very interested in using archaeology to unearth sort of the Mexican artifacts. And unlike Native American artifacts, the indigenous artifacts of Mexico were used as for nation building. The Aztecs, and then you go to that big, huge museum there, and it's part of the state of Mexico's, the proud warrior past of the Aztecs and the Mayans and the like. They weren't treated that way, but it becomes part of it. So that never in the same way happened with the United States. Mm-hmm. But I know Mexico, and then I just don't know in Brazil and Central America. But yeah, please, you might.
No, I mean, I was just impressed by the similarity of the logic, right? Although mestizaje as a sort of eugenics discourse predated Boas, but nonetheless, I can only imagine one audience participant mentioned Gilberto Freire. I don't speak Portuguese, so I probably butchered that last name, as someone who studied under Boas in at Columbia and is noted as being sort of the architect of the Brazilian national identity discourse of race mixture and the sort of racial democracy and the equality that comes from race mixture.
I will be looking into that, though. Thank you, though.
Yeah, so I guess continuing then on this this question of racial amalgamation, I'm going to start with this question at the end and ask if Boas and his notion of mixed race offspring creating just a bunch of octoroons who would be equal demonstrated a sort of aggrandized sense of optimism or naivete.
Naivete or optimism? I think it was, I would say naivete. Mm-hmm. So what I didn't mention is like the week after, like maybe 2 weeks, less than a month after Boas gives this speech that gets published in the Crisis, Du Bois writes another article called The Marrying of Black Folks, where he backs away from this argument a little bit, saying that, you know, we're not ready right now for many, many generations to start widespread, marrying white folks because of both, he says ethical, cultural, and religious things. The gulfs are just too much. And that is much more salient than, he doesn't say this, but he implies, head shape, skin color, whatever physical features, that the cultural features, the ethical features are much more. He says, I'm not against marriage. And he even goes as far as saying some mixtures, and I think he was probably referring to himself, come out with fine, indeed, handsome stock or something like that. And he says, but you have to realize that every race has stocks you should not breed. And he's talking very carefully, almost like this eugenic stuff. But he says, don't think the white folks don't have those stocks either. But we need to be very careful, but we're not ready yet to start marrying white folks on a large scale. Now, if you fall in love with one, that's fine. And he writes in the very first person. A lot of times he's a little bit more detached. So he's speaking to his audience, like, let's not go too far down this line. He doesn't call Boas out specifically, but it's pretty clear that he's addressing at least the same argument.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. So in thinking about anthropology and its contributions to sort of pseudoscientific racism, the logics of coloniality, but also its movement away from them and addressing that history to chart a new path of the future. What do you think anthropology can do now to move us forward?
Let it burn. No, I'm just teasing.
Okay.
Well, I think we got to keep asserting our counter-hegemonic sort of decolonial approach through transforming anthropology and other vehicles. And like we're here, and people like Deborah Thomas and Ashanti Rees, Bianca, Savannah Sage, yourself, Ryan Cecil Jepson, Jonathan Rosa, Jonathan Jackson. That's a lot of people. I mean, we're putting out work that's not just scholarship, but it's the cultural work through popular culture, public media, and that is to be reckoned with. And I believe we have to even do more sort of recruiting, because if anthropology stays so unbearably white, it will not survive the 21st century. I'm just throwing that out there. I think all disciplines are going to have to adapt, pivot, and bring in more people so it looks more like the country writ large. If not, it's going to be both anachronistic, it's going to look weird, and it won't be sort of effective. So I think we are really in a position where we have to do the work now in recruiting, sophomores and juniors in order to bring them through the ranks so that we can have a discipline worthwhile. And talk about the anti-racism work that needs to happen in the disciplines. I think that is, the minimum if we want these traditional disciplines to have relevance. If not, the whole interdisciplinary thing, American studies, African American women's studies, they're going to just blow us out of the water. And, anthropology, that was so 19th century or 20th century. And that's a very real, I hope that doesn't happen, but that's a very real prospect if we don't do the work and start bringing in, through Mellon Mays, through whatever mechanism we can. It's incumbent upon us to diversify the professoriate starting now. Okay, I'll get off my little horse, but my soapbox.
No, yeah. I think that's a great contribution, and it actually leads me to wanting to hear your thoughts on how sort of Me Too, research is shamed, or me search, and scholars of color tend to want to research and investigate the issues that are important to them that have also been underrepresented in the field, yet there is this kind of notion that the objectivity of me search is, first of all, the objectivity should be a goal, and that also somehow research is compromised if the researcher is too close to what is being ethnographically investigated. And that kind of seems like a contradiction of the possibility that you outlined, right? The way that me search is undermined.
Yeah, so if anthropology wants to remain relevant, that whole discourse has to be thrown out, and we have to embrace a rhetoric of sort of explicit anti-racism. And that means people need to be not only empowered, supported, invested in pursuing the anthropology they think is important. And if it's me search, it's me. All research is me search at some level. Here's a little fun fact. I was adopted through the Children's Aid Society. So talk about a little me search. And one of the reasons I found the whole orphan train piece is because I was digging around my own ancestry. So when you're adopted, of course, you don't have any records. So you just have to go on like the closest DNA relatives you have. And I've gotten really good at, backing up family trees and all this sort of stuff, ancestries.com. And I found one of my great grandfathers, or actually my grandfather, were these Czechsons. Have you ever heard of them? So they were the Czech families that migrated to Texas, sort of right before and after the Civil War, to grow cotton and all this sort of stuff. And so they were Catholic, and the Catholics had their own orphan train, small little community in Fayette, Texas. They had their Catholic orphan trains because they didn't want to put them with Protestants. So the Catholics and Protestants had warring orphan trains. They both thought it was a good idea. So they had to identify Catholic communities to put these Catholic children on. And this small community in Texas, where my great-grandfather was from, was a regular stop of the orphan trains because they wanted them to be Catholics. And so, yeah, I've got a bit of a multiracial heritage, but part of one side of the family is Czech. And so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that interesting and personal history.
So I'm just saying, this doesn't seem like me search. It's like, it's me search. My round head,
But I mean, also the academy and anthropology as a discipline was essentially founded by me search, but specifically the me search of white men.
Right.
But that wasn't problematic or, an issue, or at the time.
But it was fun doing the research. That's how I got kind of involved with the orphan trains. It was kind of part of my own personal history.
And look what it brought to us.
I know.
Well, I just want to thank you again so much for your presentation and also for engaging with me in discussion. I could go on, but I know I'll have an opportunity to talk with you again some more tomorrow. And hopefully join who maybe have further questions. Thank you again so much for and thank you, Dina, for the opportunity to join in this discussion with.
No, and thank you for such a great conversation. You got me all riled up. I got all that.
Me too.
So no, that was really good. Thank you.
No, and thanks. And Sabia points out that we do have a workshop tomorrow, and I think we will put if you've signed up for it, it's you'll know about its details, especially for graduate students, PhD students, junior faculty, but folks in the disciplines are welcome to it. And we look forward to, it's more of a casual conversation about the work that is to be done, very much along the lines of the last part of the conversation. Sabia, thank you for such a great interview and conversation. I felt like there was 2 events here, and for a fabulous talk, Lee. Thank you for sharing that work. Thanks to all of our folks who were staying with us throughout the evening and great questions.
Wow, that was a fast hour and a half. We really went through it, didn't we?
I know.
Yes, time flies when you're having fun. That's for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. And thanks so much. We had a wonderful time hosting you here. I look forward to hosting you in person. But in the meantime, in the world of Zoom, we will see you, those folks who are there tomorrow. And thank you again to everyone. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye. Great to see you. Bye-bye.